From the moment of unification, Spain became a powerful kingdom for several centuries, with its territories extending far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Its mighty naval fleet allowed it to maintain significant colonies. Nonetheless, power on such a scale was difficult to sustain, which ultimately led to the War of the Spanish Succession. The most important colonies were located in Latin America, as it was here that gold and silver were mined, which formed the basis of royal revenues. This significantly increased the power of Spain, which at that time was referred to as the empire on which the sun never sets. At the same time, precious metals are considered the main reason for Spain's decline. The more gold Spanish ships brought to Europe, the cheaper it became, and the cheaper gold became, the more had to be imported to cover all royal expenses. Thus, the Spanish economy fell into a resource trap, which became the source of most of its economic problems. The situation was so dire that on the eve of the war, the Spanish treasury was empty. There was no regular army, and the contingent of mercenaries in service amounted to only 15,000 soldiers. Even to supply these troops, Spain was forced to purchase weapons and uniforms from France, as it lacked its own production. The situation was even worse with the royal family. The long-standing tradition of the Spanish Habsburgs marrying the Austrian Habsburgs led to the extinction of the dynasty. Of course, such marriages allowed the alliances between the two branches of the Habsburgs to be maintained, but the price for this was the health of the Spanish kings. With each new generation, the children accumulated more illnesses. King Charles II, who ascended to the throne in 1665, had poor health and was unable to govern the country. He was also unable to have children, which raised the question of a successor to the crown. The most ambitious cousins of Charles II immediately began to lay claim to it: the French King Louis XIV and his son, Prince Louis of Valois, the Grand Dauphin, as well as the Austrian Emperor Leopold I. This alone was enough reason for conflict. Yet, the issue of succession also concerned Britain and the Netherlands. Until recently, they had been at war with France when it tried to establish its hegemony in Europe. Now, they faced the threat of France uniting with Spain, which would turn it into the most powerful country in Europe. To avoid war, a compromise was reached in The Hague in 1698. According to the agreement, the Spanish crown was to be inherited by the young Joseph Ferdinand Wittelsbach, a great-nephew of Charles II. As compensation, Naples and Sicily were to go to France, and Lombardy to Austria. Spain, at the same time, was not even informed that its territories would be divided. A year later, Joseph Ferdinand died, and talk of war over the Spanish succession resurfaced. All the same, another compromise was reached. Charles Habsburg, the younger son of Emperor Leopold, was to become King of Spain. In addition to its previous gains, France would also receive Navarre and the Duchy of Milan. This time, neither Spain nor Austria were informed of this decision. When the Treaty of London became known, Austria reacted particularly negatively. The Austrians considered the lands in Italy to be more significant gains than the Spanish crown. The Spanish also viewed this treaty unfavorably. The prospect of dividing the kingdom had been unacceptable to them since the Treaty of The Hague in 1698. When even more of their kingdom's territories were cut off in the Treaty of London, it provoked an even more intense reaction. Then the King of France, Louis XIV, resorted to cunning. While agreeing to the division of Spanish territories in international treaties, his agents in Spain itself persuaded the local nobility that the French supported the unity of their kingdom. As a result, during the war, most Spaniards sided with the Bourbons. On November 1st, 1700, King Charles II of Spain died. In his will, his successor was named as the grandson of the French king, Philip, Duke of Anjou. Just 15 days later, he was proclaimed King Philip V of Spain at Versailles. Louis XIV added that Philip and his descendants could lay claim to the French crown, laying the foundation for the potential unification of the two kingdoms. Thus, the proclamation of Philip V as King of Spain meant war with Austria for France. The proclamation of plans to unite France and Spain meant war with Britain and the Netherlands. Therefore, Louis XIV simultaneously imposed trade restrictions on his future opponents and also declared that he would recognize James III of the Stuart dynasty as the King of Britain, whose father had lost the English crown 13 years earlier and died in France. And while the new King of Spain was heading to Madrid, French troops, with the support of local Spanish garrisons, occupied the Spanish Netherlands and Lombardy. The road to the latter was blocked for the French by the Duchy of Savoy, but its ruler, Victor Amadeus II, became an ally of France by marrying his daughter to Philip V. At the same time, Austria, which considered Milan its territory according to the Hague Treaty, also sent 35,000 soldiers under the command of Prince Eugene of Savoy, who had already gained fame as a talented military leader. The French positioned their troops along the Adige River, intending to stop the Austrians at the crossing. Then, Prince Eugene divided his forces. While the French were concentrating their troops at Ostiglia, believing that this would be the point of breakthrough, the Austrians crossed the Adige further downstream and captured the town of Carpi. After this, Marshal Villeroy arrived in Italy with reinforcements and was tasked with driving the Austrians out. He commanded 40,000 Spanish-French troops. But at the Battle of Chiari, Eugene of Savoy lured him into an ambush and defeated him. The retreating French were caught by Prince Eugene near Cremona. This time, the Austrian attack was so unexpected that Marshal Villeroy learned about the battle itself from the Austrian soldiers who had captured him. Upon learning of the defeat in Italy, the French king sent 35,000 soldiers to Italy, commanded by the best French military leader, Louis-Joseph de Vendôme. The armies met at Luzzara. The battle, which lasted for 2 days, caused significant losses on both sides. The French retreated from the battlefield, and the Austrians no longer had the strength to continue their advance. A year later, Eugene of Savoy was recalled to Vienna. Despite the fact that hostilities had already been ongoing in Italy for a year, the war was only officially declared in May 1702. English troops landed in the Netherlands under the command of John Churchill, better known as the first Duke of Marlborough. In alliance with the Dutch, the English besieged Liège. Meanwhile, imperial forces approached the Rhine. Nevertheless, their advance was halted by the siege of Landau. While Louis XIV's garrison held out in defense, the king sought a way to divert the imperial forces from the French border. Ultimately, he formed an alliance with the Duke of Bavaria, Maximilian II, promising him the Spanish Netherlands. The unexpected move of the Bavarians siding with the French forced the imperial troops, who had just captured Landau, to halt their advance. Soon after, a 30,000-strong French army under Marshal Villars approached the Rhine. He waited for winter, when the enemy forces would disperse for the season, and then unexpectedly crossed the river and defeated the imperial army. From there, he headed toward Bavaria, where he defeated another imperial army. Now, the Franco-Bavarian forces threatened to advance on Vienna. The Duke of Marlborough decided to save the emperor, though the Dutch troops refused to march with him, as it would leave their homeland unprotected against the French forces stationed on the border. Marlborough then resorted to trickery. Pretending to march toward the Spanish Netherlands, he began retreating into Germany. The French, who were pursuing him, also headed in that direction, paying no attention to the poorly defended Netherlands. Meanwhile, another theater of combat was developing at sea. Since 1690, impoverished Spain had been unable to transport gold from its colonies in the Americas. By 1702, silver and gold worth 130 million pesos, along with other treasures worth another 30 million, had accumulated in Veracruz. Spanish ships carrying these valuables were now to be escorted by the French. At the same time, a small French squadron of 4 ships sailed to Cartagena. There, it encountered the English, who outnumbered them and had superior ships. Yet, after their admiral, John Benbow, was wounded, the English ships lost command and were defeated. The British sent a fleet to intercept the Spanish treasure. Near the Azores, the Spanish-French fleet successfully bypassed them. The British were only able to catch up with them near the Spanish coast. There, a naval battle took place. While the British fleet attacked the bay, their naval landing force stormed Vigo from the land. Despite the British victory, most of the treasures had already been sent to the capital. As a trophy, the British captured 5 ships, 20 million pesos in silver, and a large shipment of tobacco from these ships. In 1704, under the command of Admiral George Rooke, the English fleet set sail. On board of the ship Royal Catherine was Charles Habsburg, the son of Leopold I, who had recently been proclaimed King of Spain as Charles III in Vienna. Rooke then transported him, along with a small army, to Portugal, which had also entered the war against France. After this, the British were supposed to land in Catalonia. On the way, they also captured the island of Majorca, but failing to find support in Catalonia, they turned back and laid siege to Gibraltar. The city was considered impregnable due to its strong natural defenses, both by sea and land. All the same, since there was only a small garrison stationed there, the British easily captured Gibraltar. The worst situation in this war unfolded in Austria. Franco-Bavarian forces were stationed along its border, while Bavaria itself was now under the threat of invasion by the Duke of Marlborough's troops. In 1703, a Hungarian uprising led by Francis II Rákóczi broke out in Beregzsás. The rebels quickly captured Subcarpathia and began advancing into Hungary. At the same time, France generously financed Rákóczi to keep Austria distracted from the war for as long as possible. At this time, the Duke of Marlborough began his advance into Bavaria. He received reinforcements from Holstein, Hanover, and Prussia, as well as 10,000 soldiers under the command of Eugene of Savoy. Meanwhile, the new French commander in Germany was Marshal Tallard, who brought reinforcements. In 1704, he joined forces with the Bavarian Duke and soon met Marlborough's army at Blenheim. Marshal Tallard planned to lure the enemy forces into an ambush and, by surrounding them, defeat them. Though the Duke of Marlborough was aware of these plans, he sent Eugene of Savoy to deal with the Franco-Bavarian soldiers positioned in the ambush, while he himself led the rest of the army in an attack focusing on the French flanks. This thwarted Tallard's plan to encircle the enemy. When the British broke through the French lines in the center, Marshal Tallard found himself surrounded. In this situation, the Bavarians began retreating, followed by the French. On the battlefield, part of the army, along with Marshal Tallard, was surrounded at Blenheim. There, they surrendered. The Battle of Blenheim was a catastrophe for the Franco-Bavarian forces. In total, they lost over 40,000 soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. Bavaria was occupied by the Allied forces, and its duke fled. France withdrew the remnants of its army from Germany. The Allies could now focus on capturing Spanish territories. The Duke of Marlborough set out to conquer the Spanish Netherlands. Despite being relatively small territories, the large number of fortifications turned their conquest into a prolonged campaign, where each fortress had to be besieged individually. Prince Eugene of Savoy set out to conquer territories in Italy. Back in 1703, the French had occupied the Duchy of Savoy, prompting its ruler, Victor Amadeus II, to side with the Allies. Eugene of Savoy was on his way to assist him, but to do so, he had to pass through French-occupied Lombardy. After the defeat at Blenheim, the French decided to focus on defense. Meanwhile, Spanish troops under the Marquis Francisco Castillo Fajardo headed toward Gibraltar, which had been captured by the British. The city was impregnable from land, so a French fleet under Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, Count of Toulouse, was also sent to assist. Near Malaga, he encountered the English fleet. Although no ships were sunk in the battle, most of them sustained significant damage. Both fleets had to return to their ports. The land assault also failed. Command was then taken over by French Marshal de Tessé, who began a siege. but after 8 months he declared the endeavor hopeless and lifted it. The Spanish continued to blockade the city, but it was in vain, as supplies were being brought by sea. In Portugal, Charles III of Habsburg was preparing to advance on Madrid to take the Spanish throne. George Rooke's fleet sailed to the eastern coast of Spain, where it captured Barcelona and Valencia. Philip V's attempt to recapture these cities was defeated. At the same time, Charles III occupied Madrid and most of Spain. The French were already preparing to leave the peninsula, but the young King Philip, who had moved his residence to Burgos, refused to surrender the kingdom. This greatly increased his authority among the Spaniards. Charles III's situation worsened. To the Spaniards, he was a foreigner, and his troops, mostly Protestants, appeared as eternal enemies to the Catholic Spaniards. Throughout Spain, where Protestant forces were stationed, uprisings spread. In the outskirts of Madrid, a partisan group led by Antonio de Valle was active. Charles III was forced to hastily retreat to Valencia. Philip V triumphantly returned to Madrid, after which his troops began to pursue Charles III. In 1707, the armies met at Almanza. The Franco-Spanish forces were victorious. Most of the Spanish lands returned under Bourbon control. At the same time, on other fronts in France, the situation was worse. In Savoy, the French laid siege to Turin. The capital of Savoy was on the verge of falling when it was saved by Eugene of Savoy, who, with Austrian forces, defeated the French at the walls of Turin. After this, opinions in the Austrian command were divided. Eugene of Savoy wanted to capture Toulon to draw French troops away and help Charles III, who had just taken Madrid. But the new emperor Joseph I had other plans. The fate of Spain was not of great importance, and the expansion of his own territories was more desirable. Therefore, he ordered part of the Austrian forces to be sent to conquer the kingdom of Naples. With the remaining troops, Eugene of Savoy headed to Toulon, which he was unable to capture. Meanwhile, in the Spanish Netherlands, the Duke of Marlborough successfully captured the famous impregnable fortresses. The French then sent their reserves, led by Marshal Villeroy, who had just returned from captivity. Through successful maneuvers, the Duke of Marlborough confused the enemy, and when the armies met at Ramy in 1706, the French were not prepared for battle. The British won and occupied most of the territories of the Spanish Netherlands. Seeing such success, the Austrians quickly redeployed Eugene of Savoy's troops there. The French also noticed the British successes, which now threatened an invasion of France, so they sent another army to the north with 2 commanders, Louis-Joseph de Vendôme and Louis, Duke of Burgundy, the eldest grandson of Louis XIV. The commanders were unable to get along, and as a result, the French army, lacking unified command, was defeated at the Battle of Oudenarde. After this, Eugene of Savoy and the Duke of Marlborough continued the conquest of the Spanish Netherlands. While they were engaged in this, the French gathered a new army, reinforced with reserves from other fronts. In 1710, the French met their opponents at Malplaquet. The battle became the largest of the war. In total, both armies had over 200,000 soldiers. The battle itself lasted an entire day. The French, whose commander was seriously wounded, retreated from the battlefield. But before doing so, they inflicted such heavy losses on their opponents that they were no longer able to launch an offensive on France itself, and remained in the occupied Spanish Netherlands. Louis XIV decided to focus on the Spanish front. At that time, Marquis de Fajardo tried to retake Catalonia, but was defeated at the Battle of Almenar. The French also attempted to occupy Sardinia, where they clashed with the British fleet. When the French began to retreat, the British pursued and defeated them. Seeing these successes, Charles III's forces began an offensive. In the Battle of Zaragoza, they crushed Duke of Berwick's troops and took Madrid for the second time. Once again, the events of 1706 repeated. An uprising against the unpopular Charles III among the Spaniards broke out, and he was forced to leave the capital. This time, Louis-Joseph de Vendôme took up the pursuit, eventually catching up with Charles III's forces and defeating them in 2 battles. Now the Habsburgs had no chance of gaining the Spanish crown. Charles III did not dwell on this for long. In 1711, his brother, Emperor Joseph I, died of smallpox. Instead of the Spanish crown, Charles received the crown of the Holy Roman Empire as Charles VI. In 1710, negotiations began, which were delayed due to both sides' reluctance to make concessions. To strengthen their position in the talks, in 1712, Austrian and Dutch forces launched an offensive against France. Marshal Villars opposed them and defeated them at the Battle of Dinant. Prince Eugene was forced to retreat. In 1713, the peace treaty was finally signed in Utrecht. According to it, England and the Netherlands were to recognize Philip V of Bourbon as the King of Spain, on the condition that he would not claim the French crown and that France and Spain would not unite into one state. France lost the colonies in North America occupied by the British. Spain lost all its territories occupied by other countries. Gibraltar and Minorca remained under British control. The Italian possessions were transferred to the Austrian Habsburgs. Sicily was transferred to the Duke of Savoy as a reward for his entry into the war against France. The Spanish Netherlands also passed to Austria and were henceforth known as the Austrian Netherlands. Austria itself initially did not agree to peace, but, unable to continue the war without allies, it accepted peace in 1714. The War of Spanish Succession solidified a new political reality in Europe. France became the most powerful country on the continent, which, despite numerous defeats, could still field new armies. Britain demonstrated the power of its navy, which would become the foundation for building its colonial empire. The Austrian Habsburgs focused on expanding their territories. Meanwhile, Spain was removed from great power politics. The country required extensive reforms, which Philip V undertook. In addition, in 1715, he captured Catalonia and the Balearic Islands, which had previously been under the control of the pro-Habsburg factions. In 1718, he launched an unsuccessful war to reclaim all former Spanish possessions.